I watched my wife smile as she introduced me as a nobody, and I remember thinking, let them laugh, because in less than 5 minutes, this entire room would belong to me. The ballroom glowed in that polished, artificial way only money can buy, chandeliers casting soft gold over white tablecloths, the faint clink of crystal glasses blending with low, confident laughter, the kind of laughter that comes from people who believe they're untouchable. Olivia stood at the center of it all, radiant, effortless, exactly where she always wanted to be, her hand resting lightly on my arm like I was an accessory instead of a husband. "This is Daniel," she said, her voice smooth, practiced, just loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear. He's figuring things out." A pause, just a fraction too long, followed by a small shrug and a smile that invited interpretation. The group chuckled, polite at first, then sharper as someone added, "Must be nice having time to figure things out." And another voice layered in, "Yeah, not everyone can live that kind of stress-free life." I felt the shift ripple through them, that subtle realignment where I was no longer a person in the room but a punchline orbiting Olivia's success. She laughed with them, not forced, not hesitant, but natural, like it cost her nothing. That was the part that landed. Not the words, not the jokes, but the ease of it. I let the sound wash over me, steady, controlled, like background noise you choose not to hear. My fingers rested loosely around a glass of bourbon I hadn't touched, the amber catching the light as I tilted it slightly, watching the reflections instead of their faces. They kept going, of course they did, because people like that always do when they sense there's no resistance. "So what do you do all day, Daniel?" one of her colleagues asked, leaning in with a grin that was all confidence and no curiosity. I met his eyes for a second, just long enough to register the expectation, then looked past him toward the far end of the room where the executive table sat slightly elevated, a detail most people wouldn't notice unless they were used to seeing things from the top down. "I keep busy," I said, calm, even giving him nothing to work with. More laughter. A few exchanged glances, the silent agreement that I was exactly what Olivia had implied. It would have been easy to react, to correct them, to force the truth into the open right then, but that's not how power works. Real power doesn't rush to be recognized. It waits. It lets people reveal themselves fully before it moves. Olivia squeezed my arm lightly, still smiling at someone else's joke, completely unaware of the shift already happening inside me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was clarity, the kind that settles in quietly and doesn't leave. I set the glass down on a passing tray without looking, the server nodding at me in a way that didn't match how anyone else in the room saw me, a small detail, easy to miss, but I noticed. I noticed everything. The CEO across the room glancing over for just a second too long, the subtle tension in the air beneath the laughter, the way certain people held themselves like they were waiting for something without knowing what. Olivia was still talking, still glowing, still building her world on the assumption that I would stay exactly where she had placed me. And I did stay there, for one more moment, letting the laughter peak, letting the story they believed settle into place. Because timing matters. Because impact matters. And because when I finally decided to move, I wasn't going to correct them. I was going to redefine the entire room. The laughter did not stop right away, but it softened, like a wave pulling back just enough to reveal what was underneath, and that was when I started to notice the details that most people in that room would never see, the small fractures hidden beneath polished surfaces, the way confidence can turn brittle when it is built on assumptions instead of facts. Olivia was still speaking, her voice flowing easily into a story about a recent deal, her colleagues leaning in, nodding, reinforcing the image she had created not just of herself, but of me, and I let her finish because interruption would have been a reaction, and I was not reacting anymore, I was observing. There is a difference, and once you learn it, you never go back. I shifted my weight slightly, adjusting my jacket, not in discomfort but in preparation, a subtle movement that drew no attention yet grounded me completely in that moment. Across the room, the executive table remained just as it was, elevated by a few inches that most people would dismiss as design, but I knew better, I always knew better, because I had been in rooms like this long before anyone here learned how to hold a glass of champagne without thinking about it. 15 years earlier, I had stood in a space not unlike this one, only back then I had been the one everyone was trying to impress, the one whose signature could redirect entire careers, and I had walked away from it, not because I could not handle the pressure, but because I understood something most people never do, that power is most effective when it is not constantly on display. Olivia had met me after that chapter of my life, when everything about me appeared quiet, simplified, stripped down to something she could define on her own terms, and for a while, I let her. It was easier that way, easier to exist without explanation, easier to build something larger behind the scenes while the world focused on what was visible. But visibility has a cost, and tonight she had decided to spend it. A man to my left made another comment, something about early retirement, or never starting at all, his tone light but edged with that same assumption, and I turned my head toward him slowly, meeting his eyes without any trace of irritation. It depends on what you consider work, I said, my voice even, almost conversational, and for a brief second, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, like he was not entirely sure how to respond. It passed quickly, replaced by another laugh, but the rhythm was off now, just slightly, enough that I could feel the shift beginning. The server who had taken my glass earlier reappeared, offering a fresh tray, and when our eyes met, he gave a small nod, not the generic courtesy given to every guest, but something more deliberate, a recognition that did not belong in the version of reality Olivia had constructed for me. I took another glass, more for the motion than the drink, and let my gaze drift once more toward the far end of the room. The chief executive officer, Richard Hayes, stood near the center of the executive table, engaged in conversation, but his posture had changed, just a fraction, his attention no longer fully anchored to the people in front of him. He had seen me. Not in the way the others had, but in the way people do when they recognize a variable they had not accounted for. Olivia followed my line of sight, her smile tightening just slightly, her hand dropping from my arm as if the connection suddenly felt unnecessary. Daniel does not really care about all this corporate stuff, she added lightly, as if clarifying something for the group, reinforcing the narrative before it could slip. I almost smiled at that, not because it was accurate, but because it revealed exactly how much she did not understand. I took a slow breath, steady and controlled, feeling the noise of the room settle into something quieter, something more focused, like the moment before a storm changes direction. This was the part most people get wrong, the part where they think power is about volume or confrontation, when in reality it is about timing and precision. I did not need to raise my voice, I did not need to argue, I only needed to move at the exact moment when everyone was still convinced I would not. And that moment was getting closer. The moment settled into place with a kind of quiet certainty that most people would not recognize until it was too late, and I could feel the energy in the room shifting in ways that had nothing to do with what was being said out loud and everything to do with what people were starting to sense beneath the surface. Olivia kept talking, her tone still light, still controlled, but there was a tightness at the edges now, something subtle that only someone who knew her well would catch, the way her sentences became just a fraction shorter, the way her laughter no longer lingered as long as it had a few minutes earlier. It was not fear, not yet, but it was awareness, the first signal that something was not unfolding the way she expected. I let the silence between comments stretch just a little longer than normal before I spoke again, not to correct anyone, not to defend myself, but to introduce a different rhythm into the conversation. You built quite a culture here, I said, my voice calm, directed not at Olivia but toward the group, toward the space itself, and for the first time, a few of them paused instead of immediately responding with another joke. One of the senior managers nodded, assuming I was making a polite observation, something safe, something forgettable. We try, he said, smiling, but his eyes flicked past me toward the executive table, as if checking something he could not quite define. I followed that glance without moving my head, just my eyes, and there it was again, Richard Hayes no longer pretending not to notice me, his attention now clearly divided, his conversation drifting as he listened without appearing to listen. Olivia noticed it too, I could tell by the way her posture shifted, her shoulders straightening slightly, her chin lifting as if to reclaim control of the moment before it slipped further. "Daniel is not really involved in this world," she added again, softer this time, almost like a correction rather than a statement, and that was when I finally turned fully toward her. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to meet her eyes directly, and for a brief second, the room seemed to narrow around us, the background noise fading into something distant and unimportant. "Not recently," I said, and I let the words sit there, simple, unforced, but precise enough to create a gap in the narrative she had been building. A few people exchanged glances, the kind that happens when something does not quite align, when a detail does not fit as cleanly as it should. It was a small crack, but cracks spread quickly when the structure is already under tension. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for effect, not to draw attention, but because the next step required something tangible, something real, and I could feel the weight of my phone against my palm as I brought it out, the screen lighting up briefly before I dimmed it again. Timing mattered, and I was not finished letting the room settle into this new uncertainty. Across the ballroom, a member of the executive staff stepped away from the table, his expression focused, his pace controlled but purposeful, moving in our direction with the kind of intention that does not go unnoticed by people who are used to reading signals. Conversations nearby began to quiet, not completely, but enough that the change was felt more than heard, like the air pressure shifting before a storm. Olivia saw him too, her eyes tracking his approach, confusion flickering across her face for just a moment before she masked it with a polite smile, the same one she had used all night, but it did not land the same way anymore. The man stopped just a few feet away, his attention not on her, not on anyone else in the group, but directly on me, and in that instant, the entire dynamic of the room recalibrated without a single word being spoken. I did not move toward him, I did not rush to meet him, I simply stood where I was, steady, composed, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was meant to. Because this was never about proving anything with words. It was about letting the truth reveal itself in a way no one in that room could ignore, and now, finally, it was beginning. The man stopped just within arm's reach, close enough that the subtle shift in posture from everyone around us became impossible to ignore, conversations thinning into fragments, laughter dissolving into polite silence, and for the first time that evening, I could feel the room paying attention not to Olivia, not to the circle she had carefully curated, but to something they did not yet understand. He did not rush his words, did not announce himself loudly, but there was a clarity in his presence that carried further than any raised voice could have. "Mr. Carter," he said, steady and respectful, and the way he said my name landed heavier than anything that had been said all night. It was not the name itself, it was the recognition behind it, the kind that cannot be faked or misinterpreted. Olivia's expression shifted immediately, not dramatically, but enough that I saw it, the small break in confidence, the recalculation happening in real time as she tried to place what was unfolding. "We have been trying to reach you," the man continued, holding my gaze with the kind of professionalism reserved for situations that matter, and I gave a slight nod, acknowledging him without stepping forward, without taking control too quickly, because control is most effective when it appears inevitable rather than forced. "I saw the messages," I replied, my tone even, measured, and I could feel the attention in the room tightening further, people leaning in without realizing they were doing it, drawn not by volume but by the absence of it. The man glanced briefly toward the executive table, then back to me, as if confirming something silently, and that was when Richard Hayes finally moved. Not quickly, not in a way that would draw unnecessary attention, but with purpose, closing the distance across the polished floor until he stood just behind the man who had addressed me, his presence alone enough to pull the remaining conversations in the room into a near standstill. Olivia turned slightly, her body angling toward him, ready to re-establish her place in the hierarchy she understood, but Richard did not look at her, not at first, his focus fixed entirely on me. "Daniel," he said, his voice controlled, but there was something underneath it, something that did not match the casual authority he had carried earlier in the evening. It was respect, and not the kind that is given lightly. I met his eyes, calm, steady, offering nothing more than acknowledgement, and let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone around us to register the shift they were witnessing. Olivia's hand dropped completely from my arm now, her posture no longer aligned with mine, but slightly apart, as if the distance could protect her from whatever was happening. "I was not expecting you here tonight," Richard added, and there it was, the confirmation layered into a simple sentence, the kind that changes everything without raising its voice. A few of the executives nearby exchanged glances, quick, sharp, their earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more attentive. "Plans change," I said, and I allowed the faintest trace of a smile to touch my expression, not as a reaction, but as a signal that I was exactly where I intended to be. The man beside Richard shifted slightly, holding a tablet at his side, waiting, not for instruction from anyone else in the room, but from me, and that detail did not go unnoticed. Olivia saw it, I could tell by the way her eyes moved, tracking the interaction, searching for a version of reality where this still made sense within the framework she had built. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral, but the question hung differently now, no longer directed at the group, no longer part of a performance, but aimed at a situation she could not control. I turned my head toward her slowly, meeting her gaze with the same calm I had held all evening, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room disappeared completely, leaving just the two of us in a space defined by everything that had been said and everything that had not. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said, and then I looked back to Richard, because this was no longer about perception, it was about reality unfolding in a way no one in that room could stop, and the next move was already in motion. Richard did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than anything he could have said, because people in that room understood hierarchy even if they did not understand me, and what they were seeing did not fit the version of reality they had accepted just minutes earlier. He stepped closer, not invading my space but aligning with it, his posture shifting in a way that was subtle yet unmistakable, no longer the center of the room, but part of something larger that he was now acknowledging. "We need your authorization," he said finally, his voice lower, more controlled than before, and the phrasing was precise, chosen carefully, because he knew exactly who was listening. A few heads turned, not toward him, but toward me, as if the meaning of that sentence was still catching up to them in real time. Olivia's breath caught slightly, barely audible, but I heard it, because I was no longer listening to the room, I was listening to the truth as it unfolded. I glanced at the tablet the man beside him was holding, the screen angled just enough for me to see the outline of documents waiting, not presented publicly, not announced, but ready, prepared in advance for a moment that had always been inevitable. I did not rush to take it, I did not reach for it immediately, because urgency would have suggested doubt, and there was none. "You chose tonight," I said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Richard gave a slight nod, the kind that carries both acknowledgement and acceptance of consequence. "It could not wait any longer," he replied, and that was enough for me to understand the timing, the pressure, the alignment of events that had brought everything to this exact point. Around us, the room had gone nearly still, conversations reduced to whispers or abandoned entirely, because even those who did not know what was happening could feel that something significant was taking place, something that did not belong to them but would affect them nonetheless. Olivia shifted her weight, stepping slightly closer again as if proximity might restore her position, but there was hesitation now, a fraction of a second where she was no longer certain where she stood, and that hesitation said more than any words she could have spoken. "Daniel," she said quietly, her voice no longer carrying across the group, but directed only at me, searching, uncertain, and I turned to her once more, not to explain, not to justify, but to acknowledge that she was part of this moment whether she understood it or not. "You built your version of me on what you could see," I said, calm, steady, each word measured, "but you never asked what was behind it." She held my gaze, her expression shifting from confusion to something deeper, something closer to realization, as the pieces began to move into place. I turned back to the tablet then, finally reaching for it, my fingers brushing the edge as I took it from the man beside Richard, the weight of it familiar, grounding, like something I had not touched in years but never truly left behind. The screen illuminated fully as I angled it toward myself, lines of authorization, figures, names, structures that most people in that room would not recognize, but that defined everything they believed they understood. I read it once, not because I needed to, but because the act itself mattered, because control is not just about what you do, it is about how you do it. Richard watched, silent, composed, waiting, and I could feel the anticipation building again, not loud, not chaotic, but focused, like a room holding its breath. Olivia's presence beside me felt different now, no longer the center, no longer the anchor, but a variable, something shifting, uncertain, trying to find balance in a situation that no longer belonged to her. I tapped the screen once, then again, confirming what had already been decided long before this night began, and handed the tablet back without ceremony, without emphasis, because the action did not need to be amplified to be understood. The man received it immediately, stepping back with a nod that was sharper now, more formal, and Richard exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing just enough to signal that something had been set in motion that could not be undone. I let my gaze move across the room then, not scanning, not searching, but observing the shift as it reached everyone, the way conversation stopped entirely now, the way eyes followed me instead of passing over me, the way the narrative had changed without a single raised voice. And for the first time that night, the laughter was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more careful, because they were no longer looking at a nobody, they were looking at something they had failed to recognize until it was far too late. The shift did not happen all at once, but it was undeniable, spreading through the room like a quiet realization that no one wanted to acknowledge out loud, yet no one could ignore anymore, and I could see it in the way people adjusted their posture, the way their expressions recalibrated from casual amusement to careful attention, as if they were all trying to rewrite what they had just witnessed in a way that made sense. Richard stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but repositioning himself in relation to me, and that single movement carried more meaning than any formal announcement could have, because men like him do not yield space unless there is a reason, and now there was. The executive beside him began speaking in low tones into a headset, coordinating something beyond the visible scope of the room, and I did not need to hear the words to understand the chain reaction that had already begun. Departments would shift, calls would be made, decisions that had been waiting for weeks would finally move forward, all because a single authorization had been given in a moment that most of the people around us would struggle to fully comprehend. Olivia stood beside me, but not with me, her presence now slightly behind, slightly offset, as if the alignment we had carried into the room together had quietly dissolved without either of us explicitly acknowledging it. "What is going on?" she asked again, her voice lower this time, stripped of performance, carrying something closer to urgency. And I let a brief silence settle before answering, not to create tension, but because the truth deserves space when it arrives. "The part you never saw," I said, my tone steady, without accusation, without emotion, just clarity, and I could feel her searching my face for something familiar, something she could hold on to, but there was nothing there that matched the version she had known. Around us, the executives who had once laughed were no longer speaking at all, their attention fixed, their expressions controlled but tight, each one processing their own position within whatever structure they were now realizing existed beyond their understanding. One of them cleared his throat softly, as if preparing to speak, then stopped, reconsidering, because in that moment, no one wanted to say the wrong thing. I turned slightly, allowing my gaze to move across them, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with the same measured awareness I had held from the beginning. And it was enough to make a few of them look away, not out of guilt, but out of recognition that the balance had shifted. The man who had first approached me returned with the tablet again, this time holding it closer, his posture more formal, his tone quieter. When he spoke, "It is already moving," he said, and I gave a small nod, acknowledging the update without needing further detail, because I already knew how these things unfolded once they were set in motion. Richard exhaled slowly, his attention briefly scanning the room before returning to me. "We should speak privately," he said, and it was not a suggestion, but it was not a command either, it was something in between, an understanding that certain conversations no longer belonged in public. I considered it for a moment, not because I needed to decide, but because the timing still mattered, and then I shook my head slightly. "Not yet," I replied, and his expression shifted just enough to show that he understood the reason, because this was not about efficiency, it was about completion. Olivia stepped forward then, closing the small distance that had formed between us, her hand hovering for a second before resting lightly against my sleeve, not with the same confidence as before, but with hesitation, as if she was no longer certain she had the right. "Daniel, please," she said, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there earlier, something real, something unguarded, and I looked at her again, really looked this time, not at the image she had presented, but at the person behind it, the one who was now trying to understand how everything had changed so quickly. "It did not change tonight," I said quietly, so only she could hear. "You just noticed it tonight." And I let the words settle between us before stepping forward, not away from her, but into the space that had opened in front of me, the one the entire room had unconsciously created, and as I moved, people shifted without thinking, giving way, not out of instruction, but out of instinct, because something in them recognized what was now undeniable. I did not raise my voice, I did not announce anything, I simply walked, and that was enough, because in that moment, the room was no longer something I was standing inside, it was something I was directing without ever needing to say so. The room opened in front of me without resistance, not because anyone had been told to move, but because they understood something had changed and instinct was doing the rest, and I walked through that space with the same steady pace I had carried from the beginning, not fast, not slow, just deliberate enough that every step felt like a decision instead of a reaction. The sound in the ballroom shifted behind me, not louder, not quieter, but different. Conversations no longer centered around performance or status, but fractured into low, cautious exchanges as people tried to recalibrate their understanding of what they had just witnessed. I could feel their eyes following me, not openly, not with the same boldness as before, but with restraint, with calculation, the kind that comes when confidence has been replaced by uncertainty. Richard fell into step beside me, not leading, not trailing, but aligned, and that alignment did not go unnoticed by anyone paying attention. We did not speak immediately, because there was no need to fill the space with unnecessary words, and the silence between us carried more meaning than any explanation could have provided. At the far end of the room, near the elevated executive table, a few senior figures had already gathered, their posture straight, their attention focused, waiting without appearing to wait, the way people do when they recognize that the next moment matters more than the last. I reached the edge of that space and stopped, not stepping up, not claiming it outright, but allowing the room to settle around me one final time, giving everyone the opportunity to understand exactly where they now stood in relation to me. Richard turned slightly toward the group, his expression composed but sharper now, the earlier ease replaced by something more precise, more intentional. "We will be making a few adjustments," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach those closest, but not loud enough to draw unnecessary attention from the entire ballroom, and yet the words traveled anyway, because people were already listening. One of the executives nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if trying to align himself with a direction that had not yet been fully stated, while another remained still, his expression carefully neutral, absorbing the implications without committing to a reaction. I did not interrupt, I did not expand on what Richard had said, because the details were not for this room, not yet, and what mattered now was not the information itself, but the recognition of where it originated. The man with the tablet stepped forward again, holding it closer this time, his movements efficient, controlled, and he spoke quietly, but clearly enough for those near us to hear. "The board has acknowledged the update," he said, and that sentence landed with a different kind of weight, one that did not require explanation for the people who understood what it meant. A ripple passed through the small group, not visible in large gestures, but in the tightening of shoulders, the subtle shifts in stance, the quick glances exchanged between individuals who were now reassessing their positions within a structure that had just changed shape. Olivia had not followed immediately, but I could feel her presence at the edge of the space, close enough to hear, close enough to see, but no longer at the center, and when I turned slightly, I saw her standing there, her expression no longer confident, no longer performative, but searching, trying to reconcile the man she had introduced with the one now standing in front of everyone. For a moment, our eyes met again, and there was no anger in mine, no accusation, just a quiet finality that said more than words ever could. I turned back to the group, letting that moment pass without extending it, because this was not about revisiting what had already been decided, it was about moving forward with what came next. "You will receive the revised structure within the hour," I said, my voice calm, steady, carrying just enough authority to settle any remaining doubt, and that was the first time I had spoken to the group as a whole, not defensively, not reactively, but with clarity, and it was enough. No one questioned it, no one challenged it, because the evidence was already in front of them, in the way the room had shifted, in the way Richard had positioned himself, in the way the entire evening had turned without warning. I let my gaze move across them once more, not lingering, not pressing, just acknowledging their presence before stepping slightly to the side, signaling that the moment was complete, and as I did, the room began to move again, slowly at first, then with more certainty, conversations restarting, but different now, quieter, more careful, because nothing about the night was the same anymore, and they all knew it. The room did not return to what it had been, not completely, because once a shift like that happens, it leaves a mark that cannot be smoothed over with polite conversation or forced laughter, and I could see it in the way people spoke now, voices lowered, words chosen more carefully, glances lingering just a fraction longer as they tried to place themselves in a structure that had quietly rearranged itself around them. I stepped away from the executive table without urgency, without ceremony, because there was nothing left to prove in that space, and the weight of what had just happened was already settling into the room on its own. Richard remained where he was, already turning his attention to the individuals who needed direction, his posture once again composed, but different now, sharper, more aligned with the reality that had been confirmed rather than assumed. The man with the tablet moved beside him, speaking in low tones, coordinating, executing, and I knew that within minutes, messages would begin reaching inboxes, schedules would shift, and the ripple that started here would extend far beyond these walls. I did not need to watch it happen. I had already set it in motion. As I walked back toward the center of the ballroom, the space adjusted again, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but enough that pathways opened without effort, conversations paused just long enough to acknowledge my presence before continuing in a different tone. A few of Olivia's colleagues looked at me now with something they had not shown before, not admiration, not yet, but recognition, the kind that replaces casual dismissal when assumptions collapse. One of them started to speak, then stopped, reconsidering, and I gave him a small nod, not inviting conversation, but not rejecting it either. Because the moment did not require engagement to be understood. Olivia stood where I had left her, still near the edge of the executive space, her posture no longer anchored, her expression caught somewhere between realization and disbelief. And as I approached, the noise of the room seemed to dim again, not because it actually changed, but because her focus narrowed entirely to me. "You could have told me," she said, her voice steady on the surface, but carrying something underneath it that had not been there before, something uncertain, something that did not fit the confident image she had maintained all evening. I stopped a few feet in front of her, not close enough to restore the illusion of what we had been when we walked in, but not distant enough to suggest indifference, and I let a brief silence settle before answering, because this was not a moment for quick responses or easy explanations. "You never asked?" I said, my tone calm, without accusation, without emphasis, just the truth placed where it belonged, and I watched the way it landed, not as a sharp impact, but as something heavier, something that sank in slowly. She shook her head slightly, as if rejecting the simplicity of it, searching for something more complex, something that would make the situation easier to process. But there was nothing else to add. Around us, the room continued to move, but differently now, the earlier energy replaced by something more controlled, more aware, and even those who were not directly involved could feel that they had witnessed something that would be talked about long after the night ended. Olivia's gaze dropped for a moment, then returned to mine, her expression shifting again, softer now, but still uncertain. "All this time," she said quietly, almost to herself, and I understood what she meant without her needing to finish the thought. I had been there, present, consistent, allowing her to define me within the limits of what she chose to see, and tonight had simply removed those limits in a way she had not expected. I did not step closer, I did not reach for her, because this was not a moment that could be repaired with proximity or softened with gestures. "It was always there," I said, steady, clear. "You just decided it was not important." And I let the words settle without pushing them further, because anything beyond that would have been unnecessary. She held my gaze for a second longer, then looked away, not dramatically, not with emotion, but with a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted between us in a way that could not be undone by a single conversation. I nodded once, not as a farewell, not as a conclusion, but as an acknowledgement of that shift, and then I moved past her, not avoiding her, but continuing forward because the night was no longer about what had been said earlier, it was about what remained after everything had been revealed, and as I walked, the room did not return to its old rhythm, it adjusted to a new one. One that no longer included the version of me they had laughed at just an hour before. By the time I reached the far end of the ballroom, the night had already rewritten itself, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the quiet, irreversible manner that defines moments people remember long after they leave, and I could feel it in the air, the way conversations no longer carried the same careless tone, the way every glance now held a trace of awareness that had not existed before. I stopped near the tall windows overlooking the city, the glass reflecting the room behind me like a second version of reality, one where the laughter from earlier felt distant, almost disconnected from what had taken its place. The skyline stretched out in clean lines and steady light, a reminder that everything beyond this room continued exactly as it had before, unaffected by the small but significant shift that had just occurred inside. I rested my hand lightly against the edge of the table beside me, not out of need, but out of habit, grounding myself in the moment as I let the silence settle around me again. Footsteps approached, measured, familiar, and I did not need to turn to know it was Olivia. She stopped a few feet away, not as close as she once would have, not with the same certainty, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the distance between us carrying more meaning than any words could have filled. "Is this who you really are?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence that had defined her earlier, but still searching, still trying to understand something that did not fit into the version of me she had known. I looked at the reflection in the glass before answering, not because I needed time, but because the question deserved more than a simple reaction. "This is who I have always been," I said, steady, without emphasis, letting the truth exist without decoration, and when I turned to face her, I could see the weight of that realization settling in, not as a sudden impact, but as something gradual, something that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood. She nodded slightly, more to herself than to me, her gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again, and there was something different in her expression now, not regret exactly, but recognition, the kind that comes too late to change what has already been done. "I did not see it," she said, and there was no defense in her tone, no attempt to justify, just a quiet acknowledgement, and I gave a small nod in return, because that part did not need to be argued. "You saw what you wanted to see," I replied, not harsh, not cold, just clear, and I let the words settle without adding anything more, because anything else would have been unnecessary. Behind her, the room continued to move in its new rhythm, executives speaking in lower tones, staff adjusting to new instructions, the entire structure of the evening shifting into something more controlled, more deliberate, and it was already extending beyond this space, reaching into decisions that would unfold over the next few days, the next few weeks, long after tonight became a story people told in careful, measured versions. Olivia followed my gaze briefly, then looked back at me, as if realizing that whatever had just happened was not something contained to this room, but something much larger, something she had been standing next to without ever recognizing it. "What happens now?" she asked, and the question hung between us, not just about the night, but about everything that came after it. I considered it for a moment, not because I needed to decide, but because the answer was already there, simple, unavoidable. Now everything continues, I said, calm, steady, just without the assumptions. And I let the meaning sit where it belonged, because this was not a moment for dramatic conclusions or emotional declarations, it was a moment for clarity. She held my gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, a small, contained movement that acknowledged more than she said, and stepped back slightly, not retreating, but accepting the space that now existed between us. I turned back toward the room one last time, taking in the scene not as someone trying to prove a point, but as someone who understood exactly what had been set in motion, and then I moved toward the exit, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, because I did not need to stay to confirm what everyone already knew. As I reached the doors, I paused for a brief second, not to look back, but to let the moment settle completely, and then I stepped out into the night, the noise of the ballroom fading behind me, leaving only the quiet certainty that I had never needed to take over the room, I had only needed to remind it who it already belonged to.